What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and normally I'm critically analyzing apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. But today we have a live stream, a discussion between me and Gabriel here over the Nativity, whether or not it's historical, or in my particular view, I don't think it's historical. I think it's inspired by Old Testament stuff and easily fabricated. And that's my position. But we got Gabriel here. Gabriel, do you want to introduce yourself and sort of, I guess, maybe lead off the discussion with like your like what position are you defending, I guess, here today?
Sure. So my name is Gabriel. I think if you've watched this channel for a decent amount of time, you've at least seen me once. I've been on here, I think, 2 other times, discussing all the finer points of theology with our friend over there. I will be defending that the Nativity is a historical fact. I will be defending the fact that is Jesus is a historical person. I know there's a lot of debate in this community, not in other communities, about that. And we'll be talking it. We'll be taking it from there. The birth of Christ, the life of Christ. Christ is a historical person, and of course, Christ is the Savior, the Son of God, the Messiah. And that will be the length and breadth of our discussion, but especially focusing on the Nativity and the historical veracity of the Nativity.
Okay, awesome. Do you have like any social media you want to share? Because normally I let people, if people come on, let them
of course.
tell people about it.
Now, of course, besides religion, my other great passion is politics. That's my little organ down there, the ARF, amrevfront.com. I'm a pretty political person on there as well, but I do love dabbling at theology. I've taken lots of theological courses here at the University of Michigan, and I'm applying to a few div schools after this. I'm a senior, so hopefully we'll be doing that soon. But I will just plug that, amrevfront.com, and of course I have an Instagram as well, which is just Gabe Irvin. That's pretty simple. So I'm not much of a social media guy.
That's cool. All right, so let's just jump right on into this discussion tonight. So I know you brought up like the historicity of Jesus, but let's start off with this whole nativity thing, like Jesus's birth in general. Now, which version of his birth do you think is historical?
No, I think the whole thing is historical. I don't think the claims really by the apostles are contradicting at all. And I would also say that the claim that annoys me the most is the one that Christianity co-opted some sort of pagan holiday and made it into Christmas. Now, we've heard this claim reiterated by several sources, especially popularized in the media in recent years. And I would take direct aim at those claims and say they are ahistorical. They are counter not only to the Christian narrative, but to the secular historical narrative. And any claims that Jesus was not a real historical person not only contradict the Gospels, which I, of course, believe are absolute truth, but also the historical narrative of people like Mara bar Serapion, of Josephus, so even Bart Ehrman. Even Bart Ehrman agrees that Jesus was a real historical person, and Bart Ehrman is no Christian apologist by any length and breadth of the imagination, but he still acknowledges that Jesus is a real historical person. My professors here at the University of Michigan, who are as secular as can be, from Jason Zarowski to Gabriel Boccaccini, acknowledge that Christ was a real historical person who lived in first century Judea, who had a following, and who preached. So I don't think that there is much to debate here as far as Jesus being a historical person. And I would absolutely say that any claim to the contrary not only runs contrary to the academic tradition, but runs contrary to the Christological tradition and indeed the truth. And I would say that's a major problem with the billing of Christmas in the modern era, that it is somehow a co-opted pagan holiday, or Jesus wasn't a real person, or something like that. Those things are all false claims.
Well, obviously, I disagree with you. But the whole idea of the birth narratives in the Gospels and whether or not Jesus existed are two separate ideas. We can at least agree to that, right?
I think for some part of it, we can agree with that.
Okay. Well, I mean, because like I can totally refute the idea that the Gospels relay any kind of accurate information about Jesus's birth and still come at it from a position that Jesus existed as a person, because his like the minimal historical Jesus that's regularly touted was just some guy who didn't have a miraculous birth at all, and so nobody recording like what happened at his birth is not something that I would push back against or anything like that. So if Jesus existed at all, then his birth was not miraculous. I mean, it was
So
just.
would you concede the point that Jesus is a real historical person?
It depends. I mean, obviously, you're wanting to make that kind of a center sort of topic for this particular discussion.
But I would say,
So,
just
I mean, I
agreeing
wouldn't.
to that historical fact, I'm not asking you to admit that he's the Son of God, that he was crucified for the sins of the world. I'm asking you to admit that he is a real historical person who lived in first century Judea and inspired what scholars call the Jesus movement of the first century. That would be what I'm asking you to agree to.
Oh, no, I mean, I would not agree to that at all. Like, for the sake of the discussion of the nativity and the reliability of the gospels and everything like that, like, I can totally, like, for the purposes of the argument, say, let's assume that Jesus existed. But as
All right.
far as like my position, I would not agree to anything historical about Jesus.
All right. Well, we can move on from that. It's a discussion for a different day. But I would say, as far as the Gospels go, we have the narratives of it being revealed to by the Holy Spirit. It's revealed to Joseph in a dream versus the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. These aren't contradictory narratives. These are two different sides of something happening.
Well, you see, honestly, I don't even come at it from that position. And I mean, we can make half of this stream or however long you have to talk with me about this. We can make it about the historicity of Jesus, and we can talk about like the Marabar Serapion, Josephus, the gospel sources
Even
as far
Tacitus.
as. I mean, we could talk about Tacitus too if you want to. I don't think you're gonna have a good time with it, but I mean, we could talk about it. But so let's because this stream, I kind of titled this stream around the nativity.
Yeah, we're gonna go to the
ha-
nativity.
right. Well, at least at first.
Yeah.
So with the nativity, there's very obviously two completely different stories captured in Matthew and Luke, and like as far as like the content of the stories, as far as like the spirit that appeared to Joseph, whether it was a specific archangel or just the Holy Spirit or something like that, that's not even how I would come about like questioning that. I mean, it's a lot of the other like things of the stories that kind of lend me to think that Matthew's version of the story first was crafted in a very specific way to portray Jesus as this new Moses type character by providing this mirror image of Moses's story and immediately setting the stage for the story of Jesus to be the new Moses, freeing the Jewish people from the bondage of sin and slavery to sin and the existing Jewish establishment. And then Luke has a totally different interpretation of the Messiah figure of Judaism, and that's why he presents a completely different story that's actually set 10 years after the story that occurs in Matthew. And so that's why I ask, well, which one? Because they both record different things and they happen at two starkly different times.
So you're asking about the discrepancy between the rule of Herod the Great and the governorship of Quirinius over Syria. I would dispute that on two grounds. One is that we already know that Quirinius was an administrator over the area, because I'm not saying that he was the Roman Magister Militum of the area or whatever title, but we already know that he was the governor of previous areas and that he was tasked with performing a census. These two dates aren't really unable to be harmonized. I think that that's a false equivalency. We know he served as governor of Syria prior to 12 BC, and he was named a consul at that time. He was named a Roman consul, not the big consul, but he was named a Roman consul. So we already know that it would be proper. It would be proper to call him a governor. It's not improper to say that.
No, but Quirinius wasn't a governor until 6 CE. Like he was in a totally different part of the empire. Like when
he wasn't. He was
the Matthew story
in 12 BC. He was the governor of Syria.
No, he was leading an army in a different part of the empire. I mean, that's just historical facts about Quirinius and his military campaign and everything like that leading up to his governorship of Syria. So, I mean, like it literally couldn't have happened before 6 CE as far as the Luke story goes. And then, of course, the problems with the Matthew story is not only that it places it in happening prior to 4 BCE, because that's when Herod dies. But also there's the lack of any kind of accounting of this slaughter of the innocents that supposedly occurred in Matthew.
Historians agree, though, that the slaughter of the innocents, if it occurred in Bethlehem, would not have been a notable historical event. I mean, that's 20, 30 infants, and that's not outside of the behavior of Herod.
I mean, I would need a citation on how it wouldn't be like a notable event. I mean, you have various people that record a lot of things about Herod going on, like the horrible things that he did and everything like that. So, I mean, like, we know a lot of those things. I would think that if he put out an edict that says, hey, all Jewish children under 3 years old need to be slaughtered and killed, that's a notable event. Like, saying that's not a notable event.
No, well, no, because in the city of Bethlehem, that would not have been a notable event. That's a very small population of people, and I don't think that anyone would argue that's outside of the behavior of Herod to order the slaughter of 20 or 30 infants in a small hamlet outside of Jerusalem.
Whether it's out of his out of character for him to do that is different than saying that people wouldn't have taken notice. I mean, people took notice over a lot of things, especially the horrible things that these Roman governors and everything like that were doing to their subjects. So, I mean, saying all that, I mean, you would need to provide evidence of it, and you just, I mean, there is no evidence that people wouldn't have taken notice of this.
The evidence would be the Gospels.
I don't accept the Gospels as historically reliable.
And then, of course, I think we have Macrobius also, but I think I don't know if you would count him considering he was a theological writer, but we have Macrobius. Yeah, Macrobius.
Well, this is the first I've heard of this particular person. Can you give me some background? Like, when was he writing? Who were his sources and stuff like that?
Macrobius was a historian. Not much is known about him, I will admit that. He was writing in the early 400s during the period of late antiquity. I got to say, it's pretty, if you're looking for contemporary sources are quite thin on the ground for this period. However, I will note that the Bible is the most historically corroborated document we have from antiquity. It's more corroborated.
Disagree with that.
It was more corroborated than Homer's Iliad, and that's common knowledge that it's more corroborated than Homer's Iliad, or the Odyssey, or even like other famous works at the time. The Bible is a very highly corroborated document.
I really dispute that because I haven't seen anything as far as corroboration go. I mean, what do you mean by it's highly corroborated?
Well, we have. Number one, we have several textual and manuscript lines that we can trace of the Bible. We know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have texts from the Old Testament. We know from other places that we found in Qumran, etc., that we have several corroboration for Old Testament stories. And this also proves the same for the New Testament. Every time we find a new cache of documents, they're corroborations of the liturgical line that we have today in the Bible. I would also point out that you mentioned earlier that Jesus was overturning the existing Jewish tradition. I would argue that that's not really accurate because he falls right in line with the Essene tradition. We know that John the Baptist was an Essene. John the Baptist was an Essene. I don't think that's a controversial take. He certainly wasn't a Pharisee. He certainly wasn't a Sadducee. And he certainly wasn't a apostle of Hellenistic Judaism.
Were the Essenes were the Sanhedrin representative of the Essene sect?
No, the Sanhedrin were not representatives of the Essene sect.
Okay. So in the Gospels, what Jesus is rebelling against is the established Jewish orthodoxy, which is the Sanhedrin.
That's not necessarily established Jewish orthodoxy because Jerusalem wasn't the only Jewish city. Alexandria was a major spot for Jewish emigres. We know this is a fact. It's not disputed.
Well, okay, but in the Gospels, he's dealing with the Sanhedrin.
Yes, he's dealing with the Sanhedrin, and he is making the case that according to their scriptures, that he is the Son of God. Now, obviously, he's disputing with the Sanhedrin. I don't think that's a confused point, but I would say that placing the Sanhedrin as the only source of Jewish authority at the time is inaccurate. It wasn't the only source of Jewish authority. We have temples from across the Levant that are Hellenistic Jewish temples that have zodiac symbols in them. I don't think the Sanhedrin would have approved that either. So
who was in charge of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, though?
The Jewish temple in Jerusalem was run by the priestly line. I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that that's not the only source. That'd be like saying because there's a pope in Rome that there are no other factions of Christian authority, that there's no other seat of Christian authority.
No, but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the Gospels have it taking place in Jerusalem and in the areas around Jerusalem, and so the visual imagery conveyed by the Gospels and everything like that figure the Jewish temple in a figurative way that represents the Jewish orthodoxy. And I believe it's Matthew when Jesus curses the fig tree, then demolishes that one temple. He throws a shit fit in there, and then he further curses the fig tree after he comes back for not bearing
Of
fruit.
course, he
This is all.
he kicks the bankers and the money lenders out of the temple. I think that's quite a good
Right.
thing. I don't think that's throwing a fit. I think
I didn't,
many of us wish that we could go into the banks and throw them out for their practices of usury. I don't think that's an unpopular position. Christ was embodying.
well, I mean, but I mean, it wouldn't be seen. It wouldn't be seen as a good thing to go in and throw a shit fit in a bank. I mean, that would be seen as a bad thing. But it doesn't matter whether it was justified or not. Jesus going through and turning over the tables at the money changers in the temple. The fact is that this was all commentary on the Jewish leadership at the time, like the Jewish Orthodox leadership. And so that is who Jesus is combating in it. He's not combating these other power sources or whatnot. In
Essene, Jesus comes from the Essene tradition.
Right. Because so it seems pointless. It seems like a red herring, not pointless, but it seems like a red herring to bring up all these other different sects.
It's important to bring up because it's not saying that he's creating a new line of Jewish thought that had never existed before and that is completely unprecedented in history. There is a clear, I don't think that that's disputable. There is a clear line of Jewish thought that leads to, that is obviously turns into Christianity. That's the Essene line, because the Essene formulation requires a Messiah for salvation. That's what the Pharisees don't understand.
Yeah, but I mean, my negative reaction was over whether or not I was making that particular point, and that's not the point that I was making. I rather agree with you that the thinking that culminated in the stories that we have about Jesus were definitely Jewish ideas that existed prior to Christianity existing.
Yeah, I don't think that's disputed, and that's why I believe the incarnation happened when it needed to happen, is because it was a natural. Because God saw that the Essenes were very close to developing the perfect idea of the Messiah, and he gave them the answer. Because the problem that the Essenes were struggling with, is that they needed the Messiah to both be earthly and heavenly. That was their problem. And that makes sense with the natures of Christ. That goes forward to the Council of Chalcedon, which kind of wraps it up significantly. But that is the same line of thinking that the Essenes had. So Christ was the perfect answer to the Essene quandary of salvation, which is they needed someone heavenly and they needed someone earthly. They need someone of both divine and human natures, and that's Jesus Christ. But I will go into now that the Roman festivals were not adapted by Christianity. The Roman festivals were not taken by the Catholic Church. They were not taken by any branch of Christianity and turned into Christmas. This is a pre-existing tradition of Christianity, not a Roman tradition. I've heard it commonly said that Saturnalia. People always say Saturnalia. But what we know is that the Roman calendar, one, wasn't stable. There was a year that was 445 days when Julius Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus and controlled the calendar. Meanwhile, we also know that popes before the Constantinian era, before 313, appealed to December 25th, not December 22nd, when Saturnalia is. And Saturnalia really starts on the 17th. So it seems that they were to choose a day that would be the replacement. It would be somewhere between the 17th and the 22nd. It wouldn't be the 25th. And we don't have the cult of Sol Invictus coming around until Julian the Apostate. And that's in 354. And that's after the empire adopts Christianity in 313. That's after the Council of Nicaea in 325. Julian the Apostate, who really cultivates the cult of Sol Invictus, changed the date in 354 and said, oh, now this is the holiday of Sol Invictus. It's because he was trying to convert the Roman Empire back to paganism. He wasn't reclaiming a holiday. He was creating a new holiday, because we know that Aurelian didn't even introduce the cult of Sol Invictus at all until 272. And even then, there was no date for it. And any date that he chose to be that holiday was called just Sol Invictus. It wasn't called Natalis Sol Invictus. So I would say that there's absolutely no grounds to say it's an adopted pagan holiday into the Christian formulation. December 25th has always been a Christian day. The Romans tried to take it after 354 during the reign of Julian the Apostate, but it is not an adapted Christian holiday.
Well, so I guess my position on this is a little different from, I guess, maybe what you might find from other, I guess, people or other atheists. So I'm a fervent believer in syncretization. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, yes. There obviously
Yeah.
theological syncretization exists, but I don't think Julian the Apostate was trying for syncretization. I think he was trying to get rid of Christianity.
I don't know if you're trying to like head me off at the pass, but I mean, it would probably benefit you to like let me actually tell you what I think. And then instead of like throwing out all these other things that are not part of what I think and what I'm holding to.
That is a very common atheistic position, and I wanted to address it before it came up. But okay. Obviously, expand upon what you believe in.
Right. So, I don't think that we've actually finished the nativity conversation, but as far as like Christmas goes, I don't like the dates that are generally thrown out by a lot of atheists. Like, oh, whoever his mythical figure in the past had a birthday on December 25th, and that's Jesus's birthday. Like, I don't really go by that. What I do know is that the birth of Christ really wasn't, as far as like specific dates and stuff like that, was not important to the first Christians. And in fact, there's still the practice of Little Christmas that's actually celebrated on January 6th. Interestingly enough.
So it's actually the 7th.
Nope. I believe it's Little Christmas is January 6th because that's the Epiphany.
Oh, I'm referring to the Orthodox calendar. I thought that's what you meant, because the 7th is when the Orthodox celebrate Christmas.
Oh, okay. No, I mean, I'm talking about January 6th, Little Christmas, which is also known as the Epiphany. That was when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist in the river, and it was inhabited by the Messiah figure that descended upon him like a dove. So that was originally celebrated by the Christians. It wasn't actually Jesus's birth, but rather the point in which Jesus was baptized. So that was the first thing that was celebrated. And then much later did the birth of Jesus become popular, and they, set forth like a specific date for him and everything like that.
So why would that happen?
Just so I'm getting there. Okay. Which just so happens to coincide with other winter celebrations. And, whether this was done to co-opt like pagan traditions and to basically have a celebration that's happening at the same time so that they could easily attract pagan followers so that they wouldn't have to adopt new traditions necessarily. So I guess my position is a little bit more complex than most people. It's that it's not that they copied any kind of tradition or anything like that from the pagans. It's more like, oh, they saw that the pagans were having trouble accepting their new religion. And so they created similar holidays in order to attract more pagan congregants and convert them. And so they end up syncretizing their faith with these pagan rituals in order to create something that is Jewish and Christian, and but allowed people to easily convert into the faith. So it's a little bit more nuanced of a position than most people.
Do you agree with the common atheistic position that Christians purposely co-opted these holidays?
I think that they ended up placing Jesus's birth at similar time as other traditions were already being celebrated, and we know that they are prone to even moving their holiday traditions in order to co-opt other pagan traditions. Like I'm thinking,
you're talking about Easter?
No, I'm not thinking about Easter. I'm thinking about Halloween or Samhain and All Saints Day, because the All Saints Day was originally celebrated earlier in the year, like in the first, either the first quarter or the very early into the second quarter of the year, and then then they ended up moving it to the last quarter of the year to coincide with the Samhain celebration that happened on October 31st. And so we see evidence of this, of the Catholic.
But you would say this isn't the case. You would say this is not the case for Christmas, that there is no purposeful co-opting or trickery by the Catholic Church to trick all the pagans into becoming Christian.
I mean, I don't think that they're trying to trick people into becoming Christians. I think that they're trying to make their religion more easily converted into by pagans, by not like but by placing their particular holiday at a time when they would already be celebrating some tradition. So it's really not that big of a change.
Then why don't we have a pagan holiday existing on December 25th prior to the reign of Julian the Apostate?
Oh, I mean, I don't, like I said before, I don't care about specific days or anything like that. Like, I think that, you know, having Jesus's birth on December 25th is just as good as the, you know, the 22nd or any of the other traditions that happen like around this time of year.
So your argument is that as long as it's the same general time of year, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why it needs to be on a specific date or anything like that. It's just the fact that they have a celebration or a tradition or something that coincides with similar time frames that other pagan religions were celebrated at. So again, just to reiterate, I'm not saying that they copied anything or anything like that. I think that they took elements from pagan traditions and they ended up working it in. Now, like Christmas trees and all that didn't come until like nearly the modern era. Like all of that kind of celebration stuff didn't start till then. And even there were a bunch of Christian sects prior to that. I'm thinking the Puritans in like the late 1600s that even outlawed the celebration of Christmas here in the United States. So, I mean, obviously this was a very contentious sort of thing. And even Christians recognized how you know, at least the pagan background that celebrations at this particular time of year were prevalent, and they didn't necessarily like them. Like I said, with the Puritans, they recognized the pagan background of celebrations or traditions happening at this particular time of year, and so.
That's interesting. I've not heard this point of view before, and you are disagreeing with the majority of atheists in this field, because I've heard, you know, everyone from like Bill Maher to like Newsweek talking about, oh, it's a copy. So you would denounce that line of thinking as unacademic in favor of your own.
Yeah, I've tried to push like on my Facebook page and stuff, and even in even on some of my videos, like I've got this one thing about a provocative title about how some Christian is lying about the pagan origins of Christmas. But even then, you know, I'm very specific about saying, well, they're not copies, but elements are syncretized into the Christian faith to make it easier for pagans to adopt the Christian faith, so that they don't have to change their traditions or anything like that all that well. They just, you know, syncretize some of the elements of it.
The Overton window has moved so far to the atheistic side that you are now closer to me in some respects than you are to them. So I don't know what you're going to do in 10 years when you're the Bart Ehrman of your world, because I know Bart Ehrman used to be considered the most, you know, atheistic leading scholar, and now as time has gone on, he's using points that a lot of apologeticists use, you know, about the historical veracity of Jesus. So you better watch the Overton window. You might end up somewhere near my side of the debate in the next few years.
So I mean, I understand that, but at the same time, I definitely err on the side of what we have evidence for. And what we have evidence for is syncretization throughout Christian history. And so I would put my money on the syncretization of stuff and not just the direct copying. I mean, I'll agree that when I first left the faith, you know, I adopted a lot of these really good rhetorical talking points, but as I've really researched the history on it and everything like that, I've come to the conclusion of, you know, more of a syncretization sort of view of these ideas rather than direct copying, because that's just how religions change. They syncretize different things into their religion, and they change their religion in ways that they know will be accepted by other people.
Religions that have a scriptural orthodoxy, though, don't usually change in their core tenets. Now, they obviously adopt different clothes for different settings to appeal to different people. But religions with scriptural orthodoxy don't really change that much. I mean, we look at Christianity in the Philippines. I mean, when it first got there, we saw a scripturally orthodox, and I don't mean orthodox like the Orthodox Church. I mean, they have. I know you know this. I'm just explaining for the audience that there is a textual tradition. That's what I mean by scriptural orthodoxy. Is they have a written down set of codices or laws or principles or something like that. So not oral tradition, but written down stuff. So we know, for example, that non-orthodox, scripturally orthodox religions adapt a lot more than scripturally orthodox ones. And so the argument would then be that paganism tried to, save its last few vestiges by glomming onto Christianity rather than the vice versa. Because that the Balins in the Philippines, I hate to take the discussion all the way over there, but this is an example of Christianity interacting with a non-scripturally orthodox culture. And we also have a lot more surviving textual evidence from, the 1600s than we do the 600s or even the 6s or something like that. So the Balins in the Philippines, for example, when the Catholics got there, were all female. Their priestess class was all female. But as Catholicism spread around, the Balins started to become more and more male. And by the time they had some gathering in the early 1900s, all the Balins were male. And so we have this as an example of a non-scripturally orthodox tradition of something like paganism, because we know a lot of pagan traditions weren't codified or written down until Christianity was king over the whole land. I mean, the cult of Mithras wasn't even written down until the thousands, something late like that. And
wait, what? Like thousands BCE?
No, AD.
No, the cult of Mithras existed prior to Christianity.
No. When it had scriptural orthodoxy, when was it all written down? Because we don't really know what a Mithric cult from 1000 BC would have looked like. We have no idea because we don't have scriptural orthodoxy from that. We do know, however, that when it was written down in 1000, and that's why there's a lot of people, not you, thankfully, spreading misinformation that Jesus is some sort of copy of Mithras, when really we know that the Mithraic cults didn't write down their stuff until 1000 AD. So I would say that.
I mean, we have information about the Mithras cult prior to Christianity existing, though. So I guess I'm just a little unsure as to what you're talking about.
I'm saying that religions or cults that don't have scriptural orthodoxy are much more likely to accommodate to the scripturally orthodox tradition they have surrounding them than vice versa. So what I would needle you on as your point is saying that Christianity adapted. I would say it's much more likely that paganism tried to save face by adapting to Christianity and changing some of their practices and their things to align with Christianity rather than vice versa.
No, I totally disagree with that. And based on the evidence that exists, we're talking about temporal stuff. As far as the Mithras cult goes, we have information about the Mithras cult. Prior to that, we have information about the Osiris cult from before Christianity existed, and we even have first century church fathers who admit to the other pagan gods having very similar stories to the stories they were telling about Jesus.
Like who?
And so, who? Oh crap! Who was it? Was it Irenaeus? Maybe it was maybe not Irenaeus. I think it was an early second century church father, who wrote down about the sons of God and sons of Zeus. Sorry, the sons of Zeus. Who were very similar to the stories that were being told about Jesus, and the only thing that they had to say about why these figures existed prior to Christianity.
Would you be referring to something like Against the Heresies? That's a writing by Irenaeus in the 2nd century. I can't really find anything for him commenting on Mithras, but that was about.
It wasn't Mithras that I was talking about as far as this goes. It's more the sons of Zeus and things of that nature. Like Perseus is another one that exhibits some similar characteristics to Jesus. The reason why all of these existed prior to Christianity is because the devil went back and he littered history with similar examples just to cloud people's mind about the Messiah of Judaism. So that was the excuse that was given by those early church fathers as to why Jesus looks so much similar to these other pagan religions. Now, as far as celebrations go, it was definitely Christianity that adopted some similar traditions to pagans that were celebrating at the time.
Like what? I mean, I don't think there's there's a huge corpus, you could say, of traditions that are adopted by the church at large that are pagan. Sure, you could point to some local traditions here and there, but those would be one-offs.
Well, I mean, as far as like what we're discussing here in this video being
like what is a pagan tradition adopted by the universal church?
The universal church?
Any I mean, back I'm
universal like universal Unitarianism.
Pre-1054. I mean, so pre-1054.
Pre-1054. Well, I mean, what I'm talking about is like placing Jesus's birthday or celebrating Jesus's birth in the time when winter solstice would be going on and everything like that. Like that's I'm not talking about
Well, I would argue that, we know when the temple was destroyed. We know that the temple was destroyed on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Ab. And the priests of the line of Jojarib were serving on that week, because we know that Aaron had 24 grandsons. I'm not sure if you would agree to that, but Jewish tradition holds that Aaron had 24 grandsons, and each of these cohorts served as priests for 1 week out of the year, 24 weeks. So they would often serve twice a year, maybe 3 times a year if you were on a certain line. But we also know that we can work backwards and calculate that Saint Zechariah, which is the husband of Elizabeth, was on the 2nd week of Tishri, which is during the Atonement, which is September 22nd. Then this is when Saint Zechariah served as a priest. He had the vision in the Holy of Holies at the center of the temple. John the Baptist was conceived. He had nuptial relations with his wife. 9 months later, you have John the Baptist in June, and his birthday is celebrated in late June, June 24th, June 25th, a few days later in the Orthodox calendar. And then you have the corroboration by the proto-Gospel of James, saying that Zachary was serving on the Day of Atonement. Then Luke, the Gospel of Luke, says Mary was visiting Elizabeth, which is the wife of Zechariah, when she had been pregnant for 6 months. This was after the Annunciation. John the Baptist, 6 months older than Jesus, 6 months after the birthday of John the Baptist, we have Jesus being born on December 25th. I don't think there is clearly a line here, because we know when the Jewish temple was destroyed. We know what day of the Jewish year the Jewish temple was destroyed. So we have it perfectly lining up here.
Actually, the original reason, as far as my understanding goes, as to why December 25th was picked as his birthday is because of when Jesus died, specifically because they said that Jesus was conceived on the same day that he died. Like this is
so you're relying on tradition. This is I think that's Tertullian. I think he's the one who said that. But
I'm just going by the earliest.
That wouldn't be the earliest source. The earliest source would be Luke, because we know when the temple was destroyed. We know the information that we have in Luke, and if you calculate forward, that day is December 25th. Because I don't think he. I mean, I don't know why.
So can you explain? Can you explain to me why? And I mean, I'm just thinking about this now. Maybe there's a simple answer for it, but why is it that a magical conception of a child has to follow normal rules, or whether or not the authors of the Gospels even cared about the normal rules for pregnancy?
Go back to Chalcedon. I mean, Jesus is fully human.
What?
Jesus is fully human. He's fully human and he's fully God.
Well, but I mean, you have to admit that it was magical how he was conceived.
I would say it was divine. I wouldn't use the word magical, but I also would say that we
magical. It's the same kind of, we have illusory shit.
We do have a pre-Tertullian source. We have Julius Africanus writing in about 221.
All of these sources that you're pulling out, like Julius Africanus, the other guy that had the M name, that was writing in the 400s, like these are hundreds and hundreds of years later, and they don't cite any kind of like primary source or anything like that, do they?
Well, citation rules were different back in the 200s. I think we all know that.
No, they weren't.
Yes, they were.
No, they weren't.
Nobody had a bibliography at the end. I mean, not even Josephus was big on citing sources.
Well, no. So the one that I know very intimately is the biography by Arian of Alexander the Great. He definitely has a section, not like a modern bibliography that we would recognize now, but he does have a section on his sources, who they were, and why were they the best sources that he could use. Also, how he was going to go about reconciling contradictions in his sources. So that's
you would
the
admit
norm.
that
That's
you
the
would admit
normal.
that Josephus, who we use as a source for a lot of this period, is not big on the citations. So regardless of whether
I mean,
that was normal in the time of Alexander the Great, with the corpus of knowledge that we're working with, this is not the rule.
No. Arian was not in the time of Alexander the Great. Arian was about 400 years after Alexander the Great died. So Arian was writing at the same time that you're, at the time of these other.
I would go back to Josephus. Josephus is not big on the sources. Tacitus isn't big on the sources.
Okay, well, I mean, as far as those guys go, I do know that Tacitus does talk about sources, not for everything that he says, but he does talk about sources on occasion. Josephus, I believe that he talks about sources, but in any case, it doesn't matter. What we would need to know is what are the primary sources that these people are working with. If
I would say
they don't
the biggest
tell
primary
us,
source, because this is apostolic tradition, the biggest primary source is Jesus's mother, the Virgin Mary. I know you're not the world's biggest fan of the Virgin Mary, but I would say, you ask your mother, you ask your grandmother, you ask anybody who's had a child, they remember the day that they gave birth to their child. And this would have been an important day for the apostles. This would have been an important day.
Outside of the Gospels,
tradition.
give me one quote anybody mentions from Mary.
Outside of the Gospels.
Yes.
That's a ridiculous question.
That's not a ridiculous question. If the primary source is Mary, then you would need some kind of quotation from somebody who was Mary.
We have sources. It's the Bible. The Bible is the source.
Oh my God.
The Bible is the source.
No, the Gospels. So maybe this can bleed into the whole historical Jesus discussion, because the Gospels are not reliable historical accounts, and that's not me saying it. That's Bart Ehrman, who's somebody that you brought up.
I did bring up Bart Ehrman.
Yeah,
well, you can't. But I think we're both committing an error here, because we both deputized Bart Ehrman, despite him both disagreeing with both of us vehemently on different topics, so perhaps we shouldn't. But I would say that,
I mean, you were the one that first brought up.
No, I said
the fact that Bart Ehrman has the same position that I do on the gospel reliability. Although I do disagree with Bart on his fabricated sources behind the Gospels.
So Bart Ehrman is using fabricated sources now.
I mean, yeah, he's using. Well, he wouldn't call them fabricated. He would call them hypothetical. So the sources behind the Gospels being Q, M, L, whatever kind of fucking sources people think are behind John.
We would disagree with the academic leapfrog they played to make it so that writers of the Gospels didn't know each other, even though that is the simplest solution. That's the Augustinian formulation. It's very clear that the Gospel writers knew each other. I think you might actually agree with that as well.
Knew each other in what way?
We've not found a scrap of evidence saying that Q source exists anywhere. I think you can agree with that.
I would agree. I would agree with that, but knew each other like the academic. Well, but the gospel authors knowing each other. What do you mean by that specifically?
Well, I mean, they knew each other. They were friends. They talked to each other. They corresponded with each other.
Oh no! See, I don't hold to that.
So you wouldn't say they corresponded with each other.
No, they didn't.
So then, what's your solution then without Q source then?
Well, so I mean, as far as the Gospels go, they are anonymous works. They don't have any kind of authorship attached to them whatsoever. They Mark was written first between 65 CE and sometime after 70 CE, and then after that, Matthew was written using Mark's Gospel, and then Luke was written using both Matthew and Mark, and then John was written using at least Luke, if not also Mark, and then we have.
So you have your own hypothesis.
No, it's not my own hypothesis. It's just not the Q hypothesis.
Well, it's not the four source hypothesis. It's obviously not the Augustinian hypothesis. It's not the. It's not even the Ferrer hypothesis or any of the other. I mean, it's your own. It's your own.
I think which one's the fair? I think it's the Ferrer. I mean, it's the hypothesis.
Ferrer is Mark, Matthew, and then syncretizing the two to be Luke. That's the Ferrer hypothesis. Ferrer hypothesis doesn't
right. For well, so No, I kind of lumped like you asked for my entire view. As far as the synoptic problem goes, I go with the fairer hypothesis of Mark, and then Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used both Matthew and Mark in order to generate his gospel, along with other sources like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, as well as Josephus is also in there. There's an extensive connection between between Josephus and Luke, being that Luke copied from Josephus, or at least informed himself from Josephus. And then separate from that is John's gospel, which has been significantly proven to use the synoptic gospels in order to generate his own gospel. But then we could, and then from separate from all that, we can go back to Mark. Mark used Paul's theology in order to generate his gospel. So really, if you want to follow all of the sources that
you would agree that Paul was written first.
Paul was writing first. I believe the first epistle that he wrote down was what, like 49 CE? I think
the scholarship's going back and forth on this now. I was actually just sitting in a class a few weeks ago, and I had learned that we're back on the train of pulling the Gospels backwards. I remember when I had my first class, we were pulling the Gospels forward. I remember my first professor said that, the first Gospel was written in the 70s, and then I went into class the other week, and my professor said the first Gospel was written in the 50s, late 50s, but he said the 50s. So, the academic push and pull goes back and forth there. And I don't think that's a debate we're going to resolve. But I also would say, when do you believe that Christians first celebrated Christmas? Because that would be an important part of our argument, is because I'm taking the view that Christmas is celebrated from the earliest.
What would be the earliest you're talking about?
This would be from the beginning of the Jesus movement, from the death and resurrection of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Oh, it's definitely not that early, because nobody was celebrating. Well, yeah, because nobody was even cared about Jesus's birth, other than the magical versions of the birth, being that the only thing that was important there was that he was sired by God. And that's pretty much the importance of Jesus's birth there. So, I mean, the actual celebration of Christmas didn't occur until much, much later. And even then, it was contentious amongst the Christian groups, as pointed out by the Puritans in the late 1600s, outlawing the celebration of Christmas. So, I mean, Christmas was definitely a contentious thing. The first thing that was actually celebrated was the Little Christmas, when the Epiphany, when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. That's actually the first thing that was celebrated, and it's actually still celebrated by some Eastern Orthodoxy churches.
That's I don't think that's what Epiphany is, because the Epiphany I thought was the represent the Magi coming in. Matthew 2, 1 through 12.
No.
That's what it is today.
No, the Epiphany, like if you type in what is the Epiphany, that's when Jesus was baptized. What is the
Are you talking about the baptism by John the Baptist, or are you talking about the presenting of the temple? Because you mentioned earlier that it had something to do with
I said the baptism. Epiphany is a Christian holiday that celebrates the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. The visit apparently the Epiphany refers to 3 different things, at least according to this. The baptism, the visit of the Magi, and the wedding at Cana. Okay. Apparently all 3 are connected to Epiphany.
Yeah, because I guess the word epiphany just means the manifestation of Christ.
Well, it means to reveal. But as far as like the Epiphany, like as a title for an event,
it just means reveal in Greek. I mean, I think.
I get it.
But I will say
that the Epiphany is also known as the theophany in Eastern Christian. Yeah.
Okay, that's.
Oh wait, yeah, but that's still one word to celebrate the Magi, the baptism, and something else.
I don't think the wedding at Cana. I don't think that's weird though. I mean, we have the same word for several things. I mean, it's all across the world. I don't think that's necessarily some sort of big conundrum. I think it would be don't think we're
No,
playing into
I'm
that.
just
But
laughing
I,
over
I,
the
would- I
fact
would
that
say though that
you can't just say epiphany and everybody knows that I'm talking about like the baptism of Jesus. It could be one of three things that it essentially makes it a useless term at that point as far as
yes, because
Christians go. But anyways,
it just means reveal. So
right.
when you
Well,
said reveal, I was thinking of the Magi coming in, the baptism. I mean, because around the Christmas season we celebrate, Jesus as the infant, so we talk about the Magi there. But I would also say, we're pointing out to different traditions, different histories. I would point out that we have this. So when would you say like that? Would you say it's the 400s, the 500s that they start celebrating Christmas? Would you say it's earlier or later? What's your
I mean, I'm not exactly sure when the first like Christmas celebrations were happening. And I'm not gonna. I haven't looked, or well, I mean, I have researched this before, but I can't remember the exact dates that I found as far as the earliest celebrations go. But what I do remember right now is that the baptism of Jesus was celebrated first by Christians because that's when the Holy Spirit descended upon Jesus and poltergeisted his ass. And then late, it only became
that's a
important
heresy.
later on.
That's of course adoptionism is a heresy.
It's not. It's not. Mark's gospel is an adoptionist gospel, so it's not a heresy. It's actually one of the oldest.
It's not an adoptionist gospel.
No, but it is.
I think
It definitely is.
Regardless of your view on the topic, I think we could agree that at these theological councils where they sat down and figured out what was right and what was wrong, they were using the Gospels as their only sources, and they were using the letters of Paul as their only sources. So at these councils where they decided that adoptionism was wrong, it was from a careful study of the Gospels and of the letters of Paul. It wasn't because they felt like it. That would have been a very weird sort of misuse of Greek rhetoric for the era, or Levantine rhetoric.
I mean, I really don't care what a bunch of old guys decided, like in 300 or 400 or whatever in the hell.
They weren't that old.
I don't. Whatever. I don't care what a bunch of of people decided.
You can't throw
hundreds
out
of years.
this. You can't throw out the historical decision just because you read it differently.
Well, I mean, you're not letting me finish.
Okay.
So I don't care what those guys decided about it through their own theologically driven interpretation of whatever evidence that they were combing through. What I care about is what we can determine from the Gospels now. And what we can determine from the Gospels now is that Mark's Gospel doesn't have a birth narrative. So that wasn't important to Mark to have a birth narrative, or Jesus's birth just wasn't all that great. But the story starts off with Jesus being baptized, which is where he was adopted as a son of God. And so that's why it's an adoptionist gospel. He wasn't born in Mark. He wasn't born as the son of God. He became the son of God after he was baptized, therefore making it adoptionist.
So the
and
reason
this isn't me saying it. This is scholarship that has identified Mark as an adoptionist God. I mean, this is a standard scholarly position in the field. I'm not doing anything that's out of the mainstream when I'm saying
I don't think it's a standard position, because there's still a dispute over the gospel hypothesis, and that's why I addressed the gospel hypothesis first, because I follow the Augustinian formulation, which means I believe that Matthew was written first, and there's a lot of evidence to be thrown out on either side about whether what synoptic solution you favor. But by believing that Matthew is first, I basically don't believe in your problem, because Mark was written based off of Matthew. And the most important part of the life of Christ is the death and resurrection of Christ for the sins of the world. So I would say it's not a big deal that they leave out the birth of Christ, because here's the thing. Mark is the shortest gospel. Mark is being written, according to Augustine, in a hurry. It's being written in a hurry in Jerusalem so they can get it out to the wider world. So they can get it out to the wider world, and so they can avoid persecution, and so that they can spread it as much as possible. Mark includes all the key details necessary for salvation. Matthew and Luke are much more in the business of being a chronicle, and that's why they include the birth narrative. Luke is especially in the business of being a historical chronicle. There are many more details provided in Luke, many more historical details, many more things that are interesting, of course, like the birth. And then, of course, we know John is not part of the synoptic problem. That's why I would disagree with you. I don't believe John was necessarily influenced by these other writers, except for in so far as they knew each other and they were friends. But we know that John was writing near the end of his life, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writing kind of just a little while after the fact. But John was writing near the end of his life. So I wouldn't necessarily say he was directly influenced, except, based on that they knew each other.
Well, not only do I dispute the traditional idea about who authored the Gospels, but not even the Gospel of John says that the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John.
Okay, I mean, that's a different thing that we could argue a lot later. But back to the birth narrative, I would say that when we look at something like Ethiopia, for example, Ethiopia was one of the first countries to adopt Christianity. We have evidence now. Many people have stated, I think it is the common opinion among secular atheistic scholars, that the first Christmas was celebrated in something like 340, 350. So is that about I don't know if you know, but that's usually the secular consensus. It was celebrated around the 330s, 340s, 350s. The reason I would dispute
it's definitely a much later tradition. Like I said, the first thing that was celebrated was Jesus's baptism. Like that was seen as,
because I would call for an earlier date based on the conversion of Ethiopia, which we know happened under the reign of, I think, King Ezana of Aksum, when he came into contact with that guy whose name begins with an F, who I can't remember. And that was in like the 320s. And so we know we have an Ethiopian Christmas tradition going back to before, when most secular scholars say that the first Christmas was celebrated. And I would ask, you as somebody who is not necessarily the leader, but certainly who is a thought leader in the atheistic field, why?
I think that's generous.
I have to be generous. I'm on here. I have to bump myself up by bumping you up.
Oh, okay. So you're like, yeah, I'm blowing smoke up your ass, but I'm just doing it because I'm on your channel.
Absolutely. Right. I'll admit that lying is a sin, so wouldn't want to do that. So of course I'm doing that. But what I would say is that what is the tenor of the atheistic debate surrounding this? Because you've already aired a lot of opinions that are contrary to, dare I say it, atheist orthodoxy. You did.
No. I mean, I'm squinting at the.
Oh, because I called it atheist orthodoxy. I mean, there is some sort of
atheist orthodoxy.
There is some sort of atheist orthodoxy.
I wholly disagree.
You would say that there is no tradition of polemicals against Christianity that atheists follow?
I mean, I think there are things that a lot of people seem to adhere to, but as far as like strictly adhering or having some kind of controlled orthodoxy about the
I'm not arguing you all meet in I'm not arguing that you all meet in some underground cave like the Sanhedrin and decide who you're going to put to death, but I'm saying there is a common strain of thought that goes through a lot of atheist critiques of Christianity. But
that thought can change like easily, like, with evidence and shit. So, I mean, it's not, I would not classify it as orthodoxy just because of how malleable it is.
I suppose so. I suppose there's some malleability in it, but the same arguments have kind of been thrown around for a long time.
I mean, maybe.
For example, the denying the historical personhood of Christ, that started as an atheistic critique in the 1700s.
I disagree with that. There's plenty of evidence. Hold on. There's plenty of evidence from early on in the Christian movement of, from surviving texts of people that were arguing against others who were talking about like a purely celestial Christ. And so I totally disagree.
Let me address that for a second, because the idea of a purely celestial Christ, which was promulgated by the Gnostics, was that Christ was a pure spirit, not that he didn't, dwell upon the earth. They said that he was just a spirit and just appeared as a human. That's not saying he didn't exist. That's saying he appeared as human, but it was really some sort of illusion, and he was, really just pure spirit the whole time. That's not a real critique of the time. The Gnostics believed that he appeared to be human, or that he dwelled upon the earth in the appearance of a human, but that he wasn't actually human. That's the Gnostic critique. They're not saying he wasn't a real person. I mean, I know Gnostics.
For one thing, Gnostic, as far as in the early start of Christianity, doesn't exactly, they weren't exactly a group necessarily. Like, there's been a lot of recent scholarship on it that I'd suggest a lot of people look into, but
no, I agree with you. There's not one. We're painting with a broad brush here because of the limited scope of what we have. But I'm saying the Gnostic tradition I have not found a Gnostic tradition that says, oh, Christ just didn't exist at all. The idea was that he was a pure spirit just walking around and telling people stuff, or that he inhabited people, as you said, like poltergeist, and just went around and said stuff. But the theory isn't that he didn't exist. I mean, that's not a real. I don't.
I mean, I didn't mention Gnosticism. I didn't say Gnosticism.
Well, what strand of thought are you referring to then?
Well, I mean, like there's evidence in Second Peter, where in Second Peter, the very beginning of it, it talks about how the writer of Second Peter vehemently denies following cleverly devised myths about Jesus, and then proceeds to fabricate.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty well agreed though that he was referring to the proto-evangelion of James.
I mean, that's not what it said. What it says is we did not follow cleverly devised myths about Jesus, and he's talking about Jesus, like just the stories about Jesus, and in Second Peter. And Second Peter is written by a different person than First Peter.
But it says in the basically 16b, but we were eyewitnesses of His Majesty.
Well, right.
I don't think that would say that he wasn't a person.
No. The person that wrote Second Peter is not saying that Jesus didn't exist. He's arguing against people who were saying that the stories about Jesus are cleverly devised myths, and so then he goes on to provide a fabricated, like firsthand account of Jesus, and so that's evidence right there of people. At least there was a group going around that was talking about things that suggesting that the stories that were being told about Jesus were cleverly devised myths and things of that nature. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist. And that's not a positive argument about Jesus not existing. I'm just responding to you saying, oh, well, the first time anybody ever suggested that Jesus was mythical, or the stories about Jesus were mythical, legendary, started in like the 1700s.
I'm saying that's when the Western atheistic critique started. And any sort of
but I mean, saying it like you did suggests that the thought never existed prior to that, and that's
of course this is very funny, because now you're actually arguing for me by saying that there is actually a deeper, even deeper atheistic orthodoxy going back to the time of Christ. So.
Well, no, not that. I mean, I think that these people that were claiming these things about Jesus were Christian. The Christian, there was a lot of different Christian sects. There was a lot of diversity in Christian thought in the first century. And I mean, to me, personally, the most parsimonious explanation for why there was so much diverse thought about Jesus in the first century is because of, the fact that there was no real historical information to go back to. Just like Paul said in Galatians 1:11, that his gospel of Jesus does not come from any human person. It comes directly through revelation from Jesus himself. And so it seems like the earliest version of Jesus we get is a purely revelatory being from Paul. So,
well, I would dispute that on a few grounds, because I would say that if the early Christian movement were truly this divided, I'm not denying that it was divided at all, but the fact that you are suggesting that it's this divided, it would have nuked itself into factionalism before it could have ever become an established religion if that was the case. If there was
that's not true, because
if there was complete discord between Paul and the other gospel writers, and the gospel writers between themselves, you wouldn't have had an established organized religion here. You would have had just another Jewish sectarian cult, something like the Qumranites. So,
well, right. It was. I mean, Paul was part of a Jewish sectarian mystery cult that eventually became Christianity. I mean, I don't see how.
So there has to be some sort of harmony. There has to be some sort of harmony between all of them, if they were to ever become an established
the harmony comes from their interpretation of Old Testament scripture.
So the harmony. Okay, I'm glad we agree on that, because I thought you were suggesting there was complete discord between all of these groups.
No, I don't. Well, I mean, I don't think that there was a complete discord. I mean, I think that there were several different groups of Christians in the first century that had several different ideas about the Jewish Messiah.
But they all
had
agreed.
several. Hold on.
Okay, go on.
They had several different ideas about what form this Jewish Messiah was supposed to come in, because there was this idea and expectation of a warrior type Messiah. This is clearly seen in Josephus's accounts of different messiahs that failed.
Well, the warrior type
And
Messiah is not part of the Essene tradition of which Christianity comes from. That comes from the
right.
Sadduceic and Pharisaic traditions.
No, but what I'm talking about is that there were several different expectations of messiahs in this period of time. Like I'm just laying out that there was a vast swath of ideas about what the Messiah was supposed to do, what he was supposed to be, how he was supposed to come. And we've lost a great bit of that information, and it's only because of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi library, that we even know about some of these. I mean, the Nag Hammadi library.
I wouldn't disagree with that. Go on. I'm just saying I agree. Go on.
Oh, okay. So I mean, I think that the amount of diversity that we see in the Christian tradition in the first century, prior to it being sort of canonized, I feel like is more parsimonious with the idea that there wasn't historical information to lean on. It was all stuff that was gleaned from the Old Testament, and stuff that was created through the Pesherim tradition of the Jews, that was eschatological in nature, trying to forecast the end times and what that would look like, how it would come about, how God would execute his final plan.
Well, the Essenes already had a pretty well-established eschatology, and it fits very well into the Christian tradition because it is the predecessor to the Christian tradition. But even though you're saying there's all this diversity within Christian movements, there is something they all agreed upon when they finally came together. They agreed that the death and resurrection of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is the reason that all humans are saved from the law of sin and death. That is a common position that unites them. That is the key detail. That is the key detail.
Well, but that's because the Christian church called all quote unquote heresies. And the only reason why we know about different traditions that existed in different Christian communities is because of like the Nag Hammadi library. So,
but even Paul was already writing against different heresies, and that was pretty soon after the death of Christ. So we have here several outgrowth movements, but they're not being led by the apostles, and they're not being led by anyone with authority. They're probably being led by eyewitnesses or others. Because the apostles are pretty much all in accord, because there is the Council of Jerusalem where they all get together. They have a debate over circumcision. I will not deny that there's this huge discord over circumcision, and they get really mad at each other. But they all do coalesce, and they all agree that the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ are the reason that the world is saved. This is an important thing that they all agree upon, because I think it's important to highlight that there was discord on other issues. There was certainly discord on other issues, but they all agreed on that as the key and essential detail. So going back to the birth of Christ, if you're going to something like the Council of Jerusalem, absolutely the birth of Christ would have come up. They would have said, hey, why in your writing, or why are you thinking, if you don't think they had written it yet, hey, why in your thinking is this so important about his birth? That would have come up as an important detail. You can't tell me that if you're forming a religion, even if you're just forming a religion in your backyard and you're coming up with a messianic figure, that his birth wouldn't be important. It had to have come up. It had to have come up in some sort of detail. I don't know if we have, notes. I don't know if they had a stenographer at the Council of Jerusalem. I don't think they did. But if this was the case, that there was a dispute between the gospel writers or the early churchmen about the birth of Christ, it would have come up earlier, and it would have nuked the movement into just sectarian violence. So we have here a non-rejection by the other church leaders of the time of the narrative that Christ was born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, conceived by the Holy Spirit. We have no objections to that being featured in the early church of the Council of Jerusalem. So even if they hadn't written it yet, if they just had the idea formulated, or my theory is that they all knew because they had all talked to Jesus and they had all talked to the Virgin Mary, there is no discord over it. Why is there no discord over the birth of Christ in early Christianity?
Well, so can you provide me with citations?
Yes, because we're citing the early church, and this is what I have from the early church. We have the Gospels from the early church, and that is proof that
No.
there is not discord within the early church over this issue.
No,
Because
I
it's
mean,
written down and it's disseminated
if you
as
wanted to
Christian
go,
orthodoxy.
if you wanted to go by Gospels, I mean, they disagree with each other, left and right, over what happened to Jesus and a bunch of different things.
But they're
So,
not.
I mean,
They don't contradict each other. There is no contradiction, and there is no contradiction in the birth narrative. There's only different
but
parts.
there is.
There's only different parts of the story. There's no contradiction. It's not a
No,
contradiction
I mean,
to say
there
the
is
angel
a
Gabriel.
contradiction. There's a
That'd be-
major contradiction in that the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke are set 10 years apart. That's a major contradiction.
That's not a major contradiction because it's not true. I would dispute that there is a
If I said I was born in 1984 and then somebody else brought some other thing up and told a story about my birth that was actually in 1994, wouldn't that be like a pretty big contradiction in like how old I am?
So Quirinius from 6 BC to 12 AD, he served as the governor of Syria. Prior to 12 BC, he was named a consul. Therefore, it would be proper to call him an administrator. It would not be improper to style him an administrator. The Roman Empire could not fully integrate Judea while Herod was still alive due to previous agreements. But a census while Herod was still alive would have been what they were preparing for with Herod's death, because they had to integrate the territory. It was not like the Romans to just go to a territory willy-nilly and say, I have no idea anything about here, but we're just gonna integrate it and hope for the best. Preparing for the death of Herod by taking an administrative census for future administrative integration, conducted by the man who was the governor of Syria and a very successful general and consul, makes complete sense. So Quirinius could be referenced by the Bible,
but there's no evidence
census.
of any of this. Like, there's no historical evidence of any of this. For one thing, so Herod that appears in Matthew dies in 4 BCE, and then his son Herod Archelaus takes over, and he rules from 4 BCE until 6 AD, in which Quirinius then takes over because Herod Archelaus was kicked out. So this is just, these are facts of it. You can't just throw out these numbers and say, oh, well, this makes sense. Also, there wasn't like a census as the Gospels portray it, because the census in the Gospels was like, oh, you got to go back to your ancestral town. Nobody did censuses like this at this time, and the census would have been done in whatever town that they lived in, because that's just how they did it. Otherwise, you're talking about displacing millions of people from the places that they lived and worked in, so that they could go back to places that they've either never been to or hadn't been to in such a long time. And so that would have been a monumental process, which just wasn't done in the Roman time period. And Quirinius did hold a census during his reign, but that census was not held in the middle of winter. And it's quite ridiculous to think that pregnant Mary rode on the back of an ass all the way to fucking Bethlehem, and while she's like 9 months pregnant or something, or even 6 months pregnant, if you think that it takes 6 months in order to get to Bethlehem. I'm not sure how far away they lived and shit, but the fact is that none of the historical elements around
Are you disputing that Quirinius was a consul prior or during the year 12 BC?
I'm not disputing that necessarily, because I was just talking about when he became the governor of Syria. That wasn't until 6 AD, and no matter how much you finagle the words or anything like that, it's not going to change the fact that he didn't actually come to a position where any of that could happen as reported by the Gospels until
the Roman Empire would have needed to take a census before integrating the territory of Judea. Are you saying that is true or false?
I mean, I don't know exactly. All that I know is that Quirinius didn't come into governorship until 6 AD.
I'm saying that Quirinius administered a census over the territory that would soon be integrated in Judea. That is my argument. That is my syncretization of why people say Herod was in charge, but Quirinius was administering a census. Quirinius was administering a census while Herod was still alive.
That's not what Luke says, though.
What do you mean that's not what Luke says? I mean, this is
Luke says that, hold on. Let me pull up the what version of the Bible do you like?
I was gonna be mean. I was gonna say let's use the Wycliffe translation, but no, let's use the NRS. Let's use the NRSV.
Okay, NRSV.
I'm sorry, I'm not a very interesting person. It's gonna be the NRSV. Let's see.
So in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the words should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, not any other kind of position. Governor of Syria. That did not occur until 6 AD.
I am arguing that the term governor could be broadly
6 AD. It's not like he was some other administrative position or anything like that. Huh?
No, my argument is that the word governor is broadly applied. I mean, we could dig into the Greek here if you wanted to. But if we dig into the Greek term for governor, it is pretty much synonymous with the term administrator. I mean, that's what happens if we dig into the Greek.
I mean, this is like nails on chalkboard to me.
Well, we'll move on because I will say, when we have the historical account for the dates Quirinius was alive, the dates he was a governor, Tacitus and Josephus for the days of his life. Tacitus only mentions Quirinius's death. Therefore, we're stuck kind of here in your narrative. We would be stuck between the words of Josephus against the words of Luke. Now, I would say that there is a little bit of a problem here because scholars, atheistic scholars especially, use Josephus as ironclad history when putting up against the Bible, but frequently nitpick his errors or claim forgery whenever he says something good about Christ. Why is that? Why is he ironclad history?
Because we have good reasons.
To the Gospels?
Well, because of the fact that these texts were maintained by Christian scribes, and so it like the section that you're talking about with the Testimonium Flavianum or even the James reference, both of those, the Testimonium's a whole insertion that doesn't match any of the surrounding text that Josephus actually wrote. So, I mean, we do this with any text. Like, it's not just Josephus when he talks about Jesus. It's at any point in any of Josephus's writings, we have to sit there and be like, well, did he actually write this? Does this match how he wrote in other places? And things of that nature. Like, Paul has a number of interpolations in his scriptures or his epistles that are debated by scholars and everything like that. And I mean, there are other historical writings out there that we have to look for different interpolations or either accidental or purposeful. And we've got there's a long history of interpolation by the Christian scribal copiers or whatever.
You would argue the Christian scribal copiers influenced some part of Josephus's work, but didn't change the dates for Quirinius being governor of Syria. So they changed a bunch of other details, but they didn't change that one for whatever reason.
I mean, what I can say is that the portions that talk favorably about Christ, Jesus Christ in particular, they seem to be interpolations, one malicious, one accidental.
I think that's very weird that you're saying, oh, well, Christian scribes here interpolated all this stuff, but they didn't interpolate everything that they needed to change their, to their narrative. I just think it's very weird that some scholars use Josephus's ironclad history against the Gospel of Luke. But when he says, Jesus lived, if one can call him man, he was achiever of extraordinary deeds. He was the teacher of those who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and Greeks. He was the Messiah. But that's an interpolation. But when he says Quirinius was governor of Syria,
so are you
the only other source we have,
are you making the case that a text either has to be accepted wholly as written by the person or not at all? Like, is it a black and white thing?
I am arguing
like there can't be shades of gray where there are interpolations in text that textual critics have gone through and identified as being interpolations in order to restore what was originally wrote.
If we are acknowledging that Josephus's work can be corrupted, and if we are acknowledging, as some historians do, that his chronology was faulty, I mean, the Encyclopedia Britannica says his, excuse me, a little bit of a cold, or acknowledging his chronology is faulty, why are we using it as ironclad history when compared to the Gospel of Luke? So, because we only have two sources about Quirinius being governor of Syria at this time in comparison to the gospel narrative, and it's just Luke and Josephus. We are down to a he said over Luke and Josephus. And we are acknowledging here, you have acknowledged, that Josephus's work is capable of being corrupted.
Right.
So we are down to a he said over the gospel of Luke and Josephus.
No, I mean, first of all,
you would argue that neither is ironclad.
Hold on. So as far as the Luke and Josephus thing goes, there's far more reasons to doubt the content of Luke Acts as being historical fictions than Josephus. I mean, Josephus was writing as a historian. He discussed his sources. He did these things. Luke doesn't do those things. He's not writing as
an objective historian. He's being patronized by the Flavians.
I didn't say that he was being like an objective historian, like he didn't have biases. What I'm talking about is the fact that Josephus was writing down things that were happening at the time. And it's not like you're presenting it as, oh, you're just using Josephus uncritically in these areas. And that's just not the case. We're not using Josephus uncritically. We're just using Josephus when Josephus can be trusted, when we know that he definitely wrote this thing. And there are definitely things that were obviously affected by Josephus's bias. But as far as like the connections between Luke and Josephus and how Luke used Josephus to inform himself, I think that
Luke did not use Josephus, because we're talking about the major contradiction here over Quirinius's governorship over Syria. I'm saying, according to you, because not according to me, according to you, we are comparing two fallible texts against each other, two texts that mess up chronology, two texts that have all these errors in them, and you are choosing based on the fact that you're not the world's biggest fan of Christianity to choose Josephus over Luke.
Well, because like I said, that there's other facts surrounding Luke Acts that make it unreliable.
Like what?
Well, like of course, there's all the things that I've already mentioned, but the fact that Luke is copying from the other Gospels, like, I mean, that right there is not something that a historian does.
So drawing on another historical source is bad.
Those aren't historical sources. Those were fictive narratives, like fictive writings.
So eyewitness accounts are not fictive narratives. I would dispute that.
The Gospels are not eyewitness accounts.
So you would dispute that the Gospels are eyewitness. So basically, I see the fundamental disagreement of our argument is the origin of the Gospels, because I believe that the Gospels are perfect, and I believe that they're eyewitness accounts, and that Luke is drawing on them as well as some other experience. He is a doctor of the church, while Josephus is drawing on other sources. But the critical point that I was making is that we are talking about two sources that, according to you, are capable of error and are full of errors, whether intentional or unintentional by the author or other scribes is irrelevant, but they're both full of errors. But you are simply choosing Josephus because it contradicts Luke. If I found some other ancient writer that corroborated the Luke narrative, you'd throw it out.
Can you steelman my position that I've already said as far as like why I would trust Josephus over Luke?
Of course, but that's your job.
No, it's not my job to steelman my own position. Steelmanning is when the opposition has to correctly provide their opposition's position.
I understand your argument. Your argument is saying that Josephus is more of a historian of the Herodian tradition, and you're saying that Luke is writing a fictive narrative based on other fictive narratives. That is the crux of our
right. So it's not simply. So wouldn't you think that it was not true to say that I'm simply choosing Josephus over Luke? That there are other.
Why do you believe it's a fictive narrative? That's what I asked before. As I said, such as, because you said name historical problems in Luke, and if we're talking about this so-called historical problem, we only have one source to compare it against, which is Josephus. So I would ask for a different one, because we need one where there are, a litany of contradicting sources, not just one where it comes down to a simple he said.
Right. Well, I mean, scholars have done research on Luke, and the fact that Luke is not named in the source. There's no discussion of sources, at least in those same ways that historians discuss it. There is, textual connections between Luke's gospel and the other fictive gospels that came before it. There's also connections between Luke and the Old Testament, showing that Luke was drawing off the Old Testament in order to fabricate information in his gospels.
See, I just don't simply think that's the case.
Acts doesn't present any kind of historical narrative it's actually true to history. And I mean, there's a litany of different things that make me question Luke's account of the events that happened. So, I mean, all I'm saying is that it's not just simply I'm choosing Josephus over Luke.
Luke was written by Luke. I mean, Irenaeus agrees, Tertullian agrees, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, who was not necessarily always in the good graces of the church.
I don't give a fuck.
But these are other historical sources that are corroborating the fact that Luke is written by Luke.
Because of other people that have said it, and they just attached names to them. They came up with the best names that they could think of at the time
This
that would work with them.
This was a unanimous opinion within the early church. This is a
I mean,
unanimous opinion.
yeah, that was done more than 100 years after the supposed gospel was written. So, I mean, those are not. That's not good historiography. And
I mean,
the fact
Josephus was writing about Quirinius being governor of Syria, 70, 80 years later after the fact, and that doesn't make, in your formulation, that doesn't make it entirely wrong. Why does this make them entirely wrong?
Josephus discussed his sources. I mean, Josephus had access to Roman records, and when he used Roman records,
the church fathers had access to the disciples of the disciples, and in some cases, the disciples themselves. These are eyewitnesses.
There were no disciples.
There were no disciples.
There were apostles. There were apostles. There were apostles, but we don't have any kind of writings other than Paul's writings, who was an apostle. And but there's no mention, like in Paul, our earliest writing, there's no mention of disciples existing.
Well, yes, because they were called apostles now.
No. I mean, disciples would have been people that walked alongside Jesus, whereas apostles, as far as Paul is concerned, is somebody who was Jesus revealed himself to that person and communicated his gospel to him that way. So that was what an apostle was. And the apostles, they only appear, after the supposed disciples, and nobody's identified as being a disciple of Jesus.
So this goes back to your belief that Christ was not a historical person. And again, that's where a lot of our...
I mean, I think that you can say that Jesus was a historical person, but still also affirm that the disciples didn't exist.
I would like to go back and address something else, though, that you said, which was that they were drawing a lot on the Old Testament to inform their writing. And I would argue that they were drawing upon the Old Testament because these things happened and they fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. And that would be our major disagreement there. Because if it happened that Christ fulfilled all these prophecies, it's not a copying. It's they're observing what happened, and they're observing that the prophecy of the Old Testament of the Messiah was realized. One second, I got to turn off my camera and take a drink of water.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that there was an interpretation of the Old Testament that included a bunch of things that the first century Jews and Christians considered to be about the Messiah, and then the Gospels
the
were
interpretation. We've already settled that.
Hold on. The Old Testament, or the first century Jews and Jewish Christians, they fabricated this information using the Old Testament, not because Jesus actually did it, but just because these are things that they expected the Messiah to do, and so they wrote about him. Now, this isn't an argument that Jesus didn't exist, because it's very obvious that Jesus could have existed in the past, and then they just overlaid these legends on top of a real historical person. But it's fairly obvious that the gospel traditions are using the Old Testament in order to invent stories about Jesus.
And I would disagree. I would say that we have the coming of the Messiah, and it perfectly fits into the Essene interpretation of the Old Testament, because he is the Messiah and he is coming into the Essene tradition. That would be the crux of our disagreement.
How would you differentiate between fabrication and it actually happening? Because I have not been able to figure out what differentiates, having the Old Testament and fabricating information and they're just being a dude that actually did all these things, and then later on figuring out, well, this is said to have happened
Because
in the Old
after the
Testament.
death and resurrection of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the Essene movement that existed would have persevered and continued to exist. It did not. It fully integrated into Christianity. There is not an Essene tradition that survives
Okay.
the Christian movement. The other Jewish
I don't-
traditions, which have different interpretations of the Old Testament, do survive. They do go on and do become other things. Hellenistic Judaism survives for a decent amount of time, and it goes off into the desert and informs a lot of the theology of Islam. The Mosaic tradition with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, only half of it survives. The Sadducees lose their legitimacy with the destruction of the temple and lose all of their legitimacy after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And then the Pharisees go on to become modern Judaism. Meanwhile, the Essenes and their interpretation of the Old Testament, Christ perfectly fulfills it, and that is why they all become Christian. It is not a fabrication, because you would have had other Essenes going, hey, wait a minute, that didn't happen. Or, hey, wait a minute, there's a huge contradiction here. Or, hey, wait a minute, I talked to one of your apostles and this didn't happen. This is not what happens. We don't have a continuing Essene tradition post-Christianity. They become Christians because they see the living Christ. They talk to the apostles. They may have talked to the living Christ, and they say, this is what we were looking for. This is what our tradition calls for. This is the solution to the problem of evil. This is the redemption of all humanity. And that's why I would say that's why I would say the problem is. I think we're running out of time.
I mean, you're not actually differentiating between fabrication and real stuff happening. I mean, we don't have.
The Essenes would have raised doubts. The Essenes would have said, I met this guy. What he's saying or what he's doing does not line up with our interpretation of the Old Testament, does not line up with what we say the Messiah needs to do. And they would have continued a scriptural tradition after Christ that continued to exist, just like the Hellenistic Jews and just like the Mosaic or Pharisaic Jews did. But the Essenes don't.
Well, so if Christ, if Jesus, not Christ, but if Jesus didn't actually exist, wouldn't you end up with the exact same situation? Like, wouldn't you end up with the exact same situation of not finding people that were arguing, oh, this didn't really happen? I mean, information was not as readily available at that particular point in time. So
but
I think expecting there to be,
we're not dealing with a massive educated population.
I think no, we are dealing with a massively uneducated population, and information was definitely restricted to those that could access it, which was,
let me tell you,
like,
the Essenes
1% of the population.
The Essenes were very highly literate. They were very highly literate. Male Essenes were, again, very highly literate, and that we do not see objections being raised here. That would be my argument. And there's a lot of people in the chat asking for sources. I will provide a list of my sources at the end of this, I suppose. But we have a few things that we can talk about more. But I would say, the crux of our belief and the crux of our difference is that I believe that the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ incarnated himself as a man to live a human life, to be killed, crucified, and buried, and rise from the dead to save all of humanity. I believe this is a good thing. I believe that all humans can be saved. I believe that if you repent, if anyone repents and lives a good Christian life, they can be saved and go to heaven. I would say that we have this information backing it up, but I would still go back to the destruction of the temple. We talked about this earlier. We have the destruction of the temple in the 9th Jewish month of Ab. The priestly line of Jojarib was on that week. And then we calculate Zechariah because he was on the line of Abijah. And we have the birth of Christ perfectly lining up with December 25th. And that is the crux of our argument, is the nativity or the birth of Christ is a historical event. We do have the correct date preserved, and we have other correct details preserved about the birth of Christ. We can calculate backwards. Saint Zechariah was on the 2nd week of Tishri during the atonement on the 10th of Tishri. This is when Zechariah served as priest. He had the vision. John the Baptist was conceived on somewhere around September 22nd, 9 months later, late June. And then we have Zechariah serving on the Day of Atonement. We know that. And then 6 months later, December 25th, the birth of Christ. That we know. We have this perfect lining up. We know when the temple was destroyed. We have a perfect lining up of the birth of Christ to Christmas. We have this wonderful lining up. And, you haven't disputed that so far. You haven't debunked it. But that is what we were talking about. We were talking about Jesus Christ, the Lord and Savior. And, I would just go back to that temple.
What haven't I debunked?
I would just say, I mean, you haven't convinced me certainly, but I would say that you have not debunked Christ as a historical person. When it came down to the Quirinius problem, again, we were down to a one source versus one source. And it's about which source you believe. We don't, if it was like 5 sources or 10 sources, contemporary sources against my one source, maybe we'd have a much more difficult argument on my hand. But we just have Josephus versus Luke. And my contention is that Luke is accurate, and your contention is that Josephus is accurate. We have different reasons for believing what we believe, but we are down to just a one source argument when it comes to Quirinius being governor of Syria.
Okay, so here's what I'm convinced of as far as starting all the way back to where you started. I'm convinced of the idea that the Essenes and other groups were expecting a Messiah around the turn of the century, turn of the BCE CE era.
Why? Why were they expecting that?
I mean, I didn't interrupt you, dude. Like while you were going through your entire spiel. So
okay,
let me get this out.
Okay.
So they were expecting a Messiah to be coming, and when he didn't come, and there was no like big public ministry or anything like that in order to convince them that a Messiah had come, they started looking to the scriptures to be able to explain why they didn't experience him coming. And what they end up finding is this archangel figure in Judaism that is the firstborn son of God, that is God's agent of creation, and all these other attributes that later become attributes of Jesus. They find this archangel figure, and they create different pesherim to be able to explain how he descended from the upper levels of heaven, where he's in a non-corporeal state, and is given a physical human body by God, generated through the seed of David, and he is then killed by Satan and his demons in the firmament of the heavens, to which he is then buried and then resurrects from that death, defeating Satan and his demons, and ascending back up into the upper levels of heaven. And then later on, he reveals himself to his followers, like Paul and other people. I do believe, is it Irenaeus that also talks about another gospel of Jesus not being known to people, like the mystery of Jesus existing and then only being revealed after his death when he's ascended back up into heaven because of a bright light in the sky. I think that might be, I don't know if that's Irenaeus or if that's another early church father that talks about that, but there's significant evidence to suggest this whole mysterious or mystery or unknownness to Jesus and the his sacrifice and what he did. And even Paul agrees that the only reason why people know about this sacrifice is because Jesus revealed himself to Paul and told him his gospel personally. And also Paul got information from the Old Testament scriptures, to which he verified with other apostles that were in Jerusalem, like Peter, James, Cephas. Well, sorry, Peter and Cephas are the same person. John is the other one that I was thinking about in Galatians 2. He conferred with them, and their gospel of Jesus is the same one that he was preaching, that he did not get from any human on earth. He was only given it was only given to him through revelation. And so I think that that's the start of Christianity. That's what I'm convinced of.
Yeah, I would say there's an interesting amount of Essene theology surrounding an archangel figure that they called Phanuel. But there was still a lot of debate in the Essene community about how this could be, because they had this whole debate going on with the Essene community, within the Essene community, about the nature of the Messiah. Because they said, okay, we have this figure Phanuel, but it doesn't make sense to us. Their textual criticism of themselves was, it doesn't make sense to us that an angel will be doing all this judgment. So it would have to be God. But how would he be God? But also, we're looking at our, the other people around us, and they're saying the Messiah has to be man. And we understand that as well. So how do we get both man, angel, God, judge, savior? How do we do that? How do we get all those things into one figure? And they were having a lot of debate around that time. We have a pretty good nature of Christology being formed before Christ is even born. And then we have Christ come down and fulfill and answer all of those questions the Essenes were having. And it answers them perfectly. Christology answers this Essene quandary perfectly. And that is my contention.
And I just don't see the direct evidence of an actual physical person fulfilling those particular things. I see people using the Old Testament in order to quote unquote know these things, and also getting revelation. Like, that's just what's in the evidence for me.
All right. And that's the crux of our disagreement.
I would say so. And I mean, I'm perfectly fine with disagreeing. And I know that there's a lot of people in the chat right now that are disagreeing with me on my particular view that I'm convinced of.
And I'm sure they're disagreeing with me too.
But I you know, am not so hard lined about it. Like, while I'm convinced of that particular position, I do leave it open to the possibility of Jesus actually existing. I think that you know, as far as having the ultimate knowledge of whether or not he did, I remain agnostic on that point. I think that you can make sense of Christianity with a historical person, but I also feel like you can make sense of Christianity without a historical person at the beginning of it, because really all that we have as far as evidence goes is Paul. You know, what Paul says about Jesus, and I think that that's really where all of the topic, or not topic, but where all of the debate really still stands. I mean, we're at odds over the Gospels and stuff, but I mean, I feel like we're coming from two different positions,
I
like
agree.
on that.
And 1 second, I'm trying to make a citation list for everything. So you can. We're coming to the end of our stuff now, but I've just formulated the first citation. I'm making citations, so I'll send them to you a little while after we're done, because a lot of people in the comments are asking for citations, and a lot of people, you're right, are disagreeing with both of us. I said it's because you've contradicted atheist orthodoxy. But I appreciate your admission of agnosticism on a few of these points. I will say that, you know, I am open to new evidence as well. I know the comments may just probably set on fire after I said that, but I am open to the idea of new evidence as well. And, you know, to me, the crux of our debate, at least on the point of Quirinius with the reliability of the Gospels, centered on this Josephus-Luke debate. And I understand why you hold your position coming from your perspective, and you understand why I hold my position coming from my perspective. And that really we reached a few kind of end points on a few of our disagreements where we just have clashing worldviews on these certain topics. That was one of them. We didn't really disagree on the the destruction of the temple and stuff like that. And I was surprised by some of the opinions that you held that were less, less atheistic, I suppose, than some other atheists out there about the Catholic Church co-opting holidays. We reached these interesting kind of stopping points, and I hope anyone who watched at least learned something. I really hope that, you know, any of my Christian friends who watched this, I don't think any of them did, maybe a few of them, who watched this, you know, understood and took into account some of your points to improve their arguments for their faith or to improve their understanding. But I also hope that people who are atheists who are listening to this, even if I didn't change their mind, think about a new perspective about why Christians believe that what we do believe. Because, you know, I would say there definitely is kind of a boogeyman perception among Christian communities about atheists. But I would definitely say that perspective exists for atheists about Christians as well. I hope that I have proven that we are not, you know, a bunch of knuckle draggers, you know, as some people like to present us. Not you, but Bill Maher to a large extent. And I'm sure even you would recognize Bill Maher's whole recollection of Gerald Massey's bogus Egyptology as, you know, a disservice to intellectual communities across the world, atheists or non-atheists. But I
would definitely agree that I hate seeing that particular type of meme show up, and I try to correct it and tell people that's a really bad meme, because all of those aspects are not, that they're not like, they're not truthful as far as history goes for the other, you know, like the other people and everything like that. I really hate seeing that meme come up. But you do have some support in the chat there. Like, somebody thinks that you won this debate, which I don't really see it as a debate. I saw it as a discussion. You know, and I hope that at least you can recognize that, like I'm not just like bullshitting, right? Like, I'm not just spouting off like things. While I can't bring up specific scholars that have supported the positions that I'm bringing. I mean, I could, if you give me a second, well, afterwards I'll probably put up a bibliography type thing, just like you're going to provide me. But all of my positions are supported by scholarship as well. So I mean, there's a lot of debate centered around this particular topic of discussion that we're having. So I definitely try to inform myself with, scholars, both Christian and non-Christian scholars, by the way. Like, for instance, we didn't get to talk about Tacitus, but I actually side with Robert Van Voorst, who's a New Testament Christian scholar. I side with him on Tacitus, as well as Marbar Serapion and others like that. So, I mean, I side with a number of Christian scholars on a lot of this evidence. It's just that there's a big divide, and that divide seems to center around whether or not eyewitnesses were at the center of the gospel accounts. So that's what it seems to be.
I think that brings us to a natural conclusion. As I'm forming my citation list, the bibliography website is demanding I turn off my ad blocker. And that's always great. So I know that some loud ad is about. Yep, there it is. You just saw the music for the ad there. I don't know if it came over, but pretty loud. So I'm putting together my little citation list. I'm even citing what version of the Bible I use, because I know a lot of people use different versions of the Bible. I tend to use the NRSV-UE, which is the NRSV updated edition. So every time they find a new scrap of something here and there, and there's a dispute about a word, they'll give you the thing for the word. Because I know the NRSV-UE is very interesting. This little side note here for including Lilith in the Old Testament, including Lilith in one single throwaway line where someone with the Lilith labor posed the Lilith to. And I'm sure we could have a different discussion about non-canonical books. But that would be less of a debate, more of us just looking up stuff and comparing notes and thoughts about it. Because I don't have a lot of hard, set-in-stone opinions about the Apocrypha. Now, I reference the Essenes a lot in this discussion. I don't know if we've referenced the Essenes a lot in the past. And the Essenes are a very interesting school of Judaism. They are very, he would say magical, I would say spiritual in their working of the cosmos. Their solution to the theodicy problem, the problem of evil, is very unique, and I believe it's perfect. We can discuss that at a different time. Of course, maybe around Easter we can discuss that. Something about the resurrection of Christ. But it's a good discussion. I really hope anyone watching it took away some sort of intellectual stimulation from it. And I know there's a lot of people still going about the whole citations list, and I'm getting them together. Don't worry. So this is a good discussion. It's always a great discussion.
Yeah. No, yeah, I typically enjoy our discussions. It's very enlightening and keeps me on my toes as far as like my arguments and things. It's also very different to have these kind of discussions with you, because I know that you come from a very different position than I'm normally arguing against. So, but in any case, I know that you got to go. I got to go. I got to call my son here in a second. But I hope that everybody enjoyed today's discussion. I don't see these as win or lose. I just see them as good discussions, and I hope that people learn something. If anything, it's to find good sources for what both of us are talking about. I'll be sure to link any of the stuff that Gabriel's going to provide, and I'll try to get some stuff in the comments there as well tonight. But anyways, I hope you have a good night there, Gabriel. I hope you get to feeling better and all that kind of good stuff. And I guess I will see all you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. We do have a live stream tomorrow night, so y'all be prepared for that. And I'm going to put up the poll for the mafiosos to pick tonight. So if you're part of the mafia, be sure to check that out. And I guess I will see you heathens later. Bye, everybody.
God bless you.